In an age of geopolitical rivalry and uncertainty of power politics, many prefer to keep a close eye on India, the fastest growing economy and the most populous democracy. Will there be inevitable clashes between the giant elephant and dragon should New Delhi fail to walk out of the shadow of history on the 1962 border clash and ultranationalism? What will be the crucially important issues on the agenda between Prime Minister Modi and US President Donald Trump during their first official visit by Modi to Washington? To examine these and other important issues, I'm very glad to be joined in the first part of the program by Mr. Jayant Prasad, a distinguished Indian professor. When we come back after the short break, we'll be glad to be joined by Professor Graham Allison from Harvard University. He is known for the prediction on Thucydides' trap between the rising power and the existing power. That's our topic. This is Dialogue. I'm Yang Rui. Welcome to Dialogue, sir.
I'm really happy to be here.
Are you optimistic that you're going to have some deliverables coming out of the summit meeting between Prime Minister Modi and President Donald Trump in D.C.?
You know, just as Prime Minister Abe met President Trump and President Xi Jinping met President Trump, they were not looking for outcomes in the first meeting. They were looking for a get acquainted, good equation between the two leaders. And I suppose that's what Mr. Modi would be looking for.
What are the critical issues on the agenda?
India-US relations are in a comfortable place. The previous president, the outgoing one, called the relationship a defining partnership of the 21st century. And there is wide bipartisan support for it. So the usual issues, if I were to pick 3 or 4, I think the USP of United States is innovation and technology. That would be number 1. How does India follow in the footsteps of beefing up its higher education system and getting the best people to work for India for its own growth and transformation? So that would be the number 1 thing that Mr. Modi would look for, because as a chief minister in Gujarat, that was his singular emphasis. Other things to look for are the perennials that have been there for the last 10 years. A growing defense partnership between India and the United States, how to smoothen the commercial relationship because there are bumps on the way. President Trump is not the cause of those bumps, but the symptom of those bumps, because he became president as a result of disaffection in the United States about the openness of their economy and a feeling that Americans were getting shortchanged. We would like our present relationship to continue because USA is the only major economy for which India is in surplus, both in trade in goods and trade in services.
I'm not surprised that people like you speak perfect English, and therefore Indians, more of them are going to the other side of the Pacific Ocean for jobs. Therefore, the visa problem that may encourage or prevent more flow of skilled workers from India to the United States could top the agenda between your Prime Minister and Donald Trump in the D.C. Do you think this is likely to be resolved this time around?
This is a mistaken notion for 2 reasons. The first is that United States was already tightening up on visas. It's got nothing to do with President Trump, because the number of highly skilled Indians who were going abroad to provide services in the United States was increasing every year. And so already for an Indian visa applicant who's going for services, the visa fee is $3,000, which is significantly high. Otherwise, if you look at the flow of persons between India and the United States, it's phenomenal. The US consulates in India issue almost 1 million visas a year to Indians, and most of them are 10-year visas. So you can imagine the amount of travel that goes on between the two sides. And from less than 5,000 Indians in the 19th century to less than 50,000 Indians in the middle of the last century, now there are 3 million Indians in the United States. And they are the most educated and the most prosperous expatriate community that United States has. So they know the value of Indians. And by the way, the H-1B visa scheme, which operates to allow skilled workers to come to the United States, India sends or uses up 60 to 75% of the H-1B quota just for India. The rest is distributed to other countries in the world. So from the US perspective, they are remarkably open to India and Indians.
What do you think of the office performance of Prime Minister Modi since he took office? He is compared to the Chinese equivalent of Deng Xiaoping in opening up the Indian economy, but several years have passed since he became or was elected the Prime Minister. Do you think he has been able to copy the example of Gujarat, his own homeland?
You know, economic transformation cannot be switch on, switch off. Like, it cannot be done in a day or in 2 days' time.
What's the current approval rating for him?
As Prime Minister, his approval ratings are extremely high. And I'll tell you what he has done for the economy. You know, European Union comprises many different countries and states. They have a unified market. India is today, under Mr. Modi, growing at 7% per annum plus.
The fastest growing economy in the world.
Among the large economies, that's true. But we are growing at that pace, imagine, without a national market, which is united. It'll only get united once the GST, the goods and services tax, is implemented, and without being connected to the global value chains. Now, we are instituting reforms in the country to integrate us better, create a better business environment internally, to attract more foreign capital. And the gap that existed, China attracted $100 billion on an average of foreign capital every year. And China is 5 times the size of India's economy. But now we get $65 billion of foreign capital last year and this year. So the gap is closing, and obviously the external judgment is that we may not have converted the numbers as we were hoping, but the future looks good.
But don't you think the climate change pact that we reached in Paris would be a roadblock that prevents Prime Minister Modi from carrying out or executing further the economic transformation and opening up of the Indian economy?
No, I think
because some of the most polluted cities lie in your country.
Right. China is the biggest emitter of greenhouse gases, you know that. And Europe is ahead of India with half the population. So to say that we are responsible for climate change problems in the world is incorrect. But Mr. Modi has made commitments of an extraordinary nature that by 2030 we would reduce our emissions intensity by 35% over 2005 levels. And the targets that he has set for non-hydrocarbon energy production are extraordinary and remarkable, and we are well on the way of achieving them, both on nuclear power and on solar, wind, and biomass. So we are going to maintain our targets to which we are committed. And President Trump, being part of the climate change agreement or not, with Europe accepting what they had committed, with China accepting what they had committed, and with India accepting its commitments, I think the environment in the world will be such that in the United States you see an extraordinary step being taken by some states in the United States that say that irrespective of whether the federal government follows the climate change agreement or not, they will ensure that in their own areas they are going to follow it. So the moral value of the rest of the world going forward on climate change will be very great and instructive for the United States.
China says that we will not withdraw from the climate change agreement. We will honor the treaty we have reached. China is not proud of the negative impact that our industrialization has generated for not only our own people, but for the rest of the world. Why do you think the Indian government, the Indian delegation, is absent from the Belt and Road Initiative summit that was recently concluded in Beijing? That's the last question about your comments on the inclusive nature of the ambitious blueprint of President Xi Jinping to strengthen interconnectivity through this infrastructure building campaign. And AIIB, of course, is one of the major players in shoring up investment in the infrastructure building in developing countries. Over 60 of them may benefit eventually from this blueprint.
I thank you for asking this question, because this is a question in Tsinghua University I was asked everywhere that I went. And through you, I reach a wider audience. See, the Belt and Road Initiative is an emblematic Chinese initiative based on your requirement of transforming your economy, of preventing a kind of slide which comes at a certain stage of development, of moving towards the hinterland, connecting with other countries overland, because the marine connectivity is there already. But you know, other countries also have connectivity plans, and by this singularity of approach of one belt, one road, it seems very Sinocentric. If you had called it one belt and many roads, it would have been easier for countries. But when we looked at the map that you released in March last year, the belt and the road touches India's periphery and circumvents India, but there is nothing about India in it. And in the vicinity of India, for example, you are building a north-south axis from Kashgar to Gwadar, but there is no mention of connecting the rest of South Asia to Central Asia through China or through Pakistan to Afghanistan, Iran, and Central Asian states. So we felt, when we explored this issue with your leadership, there's very little indication that we got that there is something in it for us. And wherever there is something, we are there. We are there with China in the BCIM initiative, the Kunming initiative. We have set up the new development bank together of the BRICS, which operates out of Shanghai, which has an Indian president. We are the second largest shareholder in AIIB. And one of the loans that AIIB gave last year was for a CPEC-related project in Pakistan. So it's not that we are against everything that China is doing in the Belt and Road Initiative, but if it is to be a win-win, if it is to build communities of common destiny, then there should be more discussion between India and China on this issue.
Thank you so much. I think your voice could be heard by a wider audience.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, sir. Welcome to Dialogue, sir.
Thank you very much.
What is the India policy for the Trump administration?
Well, I think like many policies in the Trump administration, it's a work in progress. I think the administration is just barely turning to the topic. I think the Modi visit will be an occasion in the first instance to get the topic on the agenda and to try to establish a relationship between the two leaders.
What will be the most important issues on the agenda for the two presidents when they have the summit? Will it be about the visa program for the flow of more skilled workers, or will it be about arms sales?
Well, I think there'll be a mixture of things, and there'll be different things on each list. I think beneath what they'll be discussing will be this relationship between the US and China, where basically India, with respect to a rising China, has a problem similar to the US, and therefore there's a natural alignment between India and the US, and that's come more and more into focus for India over the past decade, and India is very nervous about having this too visible. But I think if you look at the documents that were signed even at the end of the Obama administration, there's a recognition that in the Indian Ocean there's a parallel set of interests, and that they mainly have to do with the risks that come from China. So I would say that'll be the undercurrent of a lot of the discussion. The arms sales will be an argument from the Indian perspective that says, well, you want us to be stronger, this military capability would allow us to be more effective, though they won't say the word China. The Indians don't like to say China, but that's what they're thinking about. And I think from Trump's perspective, a bilateral trade is always a important bottom line for him. And so he'll be interested in what is it in the trade relationship that'll be good for the U.S.
We need to take a closer look at the China policy of New Delhi, because with the end of the Cold War back in 1991, it seems pretty strange for most of the Chinese who may have followed our relationship with New Delhi that many generations of the politicians in New Delhi are still obsessively and strangely obsessed with China. When you said India has a problem similar to Washington, we feel more confused because it seems few in China take India very seriously. At the same time, ironically, Indians keep talking about why China comes across as the public enemy number one. And if you look at the nationalist newspapers in New Delhi, and you would be taken aback by the noise on geopolitical rivalry between these two countries. There has not been a single bullet to be fired since 1962, the border clash. So we don't know why India has been so concerned about China.
Well, I would say that that may be a Chinese perspective, but a person looking at it from outside, let's imagine a Martian strategist watching, would say, wait a minute, next door to me, I'm India, has emerged a huge economic superpower just over the past generation. Indeed, I write in my new book about Thucydides' trap, every 2 years since the great financial crisis, every 2 years, just the increment of growth in China has been bigger than India, than the whole GDP. So if you're sitting there and you're thinking, wait a minute.
We are 3 times their economic size, right?
Yeah, and you're getting bigger every time. Every 2 years, you make a whole new India. So the Indians are looking and saying, my Lord, look at this big, strong power next door to us. Now, in fact, there are a number of border differences that are relevant. They've been put on the shelf for time being, but as China is bigger and stronger, maybe not. If you look, for example, at some of the passport issues, that's become an issue, over time. So from an Indian perspective, they're looking over the long run, saying China is becoming a more, bigger challenge for us. From the American perspective, again, the recognition of a rising China that actually is threatening to displace a ruling U.S. in the Asian order, an Asian order in which India has been an odd man out, but now you can see this alignment of interests. So I would say that's the substructure of the conversation.
It seems that most of the Indians and the American policymakers are still in the shadow of the 20th century. They are still held hostage by the Cold War mentality. At the same time, President Xi Jinping says, look, the Belt and Road Initiative ushers in a new era of being more inclusive. We welcome every country, every economy to jump on the wagon and to enjoy the free riding. Unlike, say, a TPP case that rejects China's participation, which seems to be pretty closed to the emerging markets like China. So what went wrong? I mean, do you think it's time to say, hey, why don't you change your way of thinking a little bit?
Well, it's a very good question, and I think that it's perfectly possible that people like me, who are old Cold Warriors, have too much of our head grooved by that experience. On the other hand, in this book, I look at the last 500 years of history, so not just the recent past. Whenever a rising power threatens to displace a ruling power, alarm bells should sound, extreme danger ahead. I find 16 cases in the last 500 years when a rising power threatens to displace a ruling power. 12 of them end in war, 4 of them in not war. So this produces a dangerous dynamic inherently. Now you could say, well, but China is only peaceful. We only do peaceful rise. I would say, ask any neighbor how China behaves with respect to them when China has an objective. Take the Philippines. Philippines had a dispute with China. A lot of bananas rotted on the dock until the dispute was resolved. Norway had a dispute with China over giving a Peace Prize to some Chinese dissident. China cut off all imports of salmon from Norway to zero until the Norwegians came back and groveled and said, please, and then, okay. So I think China traditionally has wanted to be a dominant power in its region, and China thinks and believes that it's re-emerging to become a dominant power in this region. I don't regard that as unusual. I think that's a historical pattern that's quite normal in the historical pattern. What's dangerous is the interaction between the rising power and the ruling power, especially as one gets third parties. And so the Indian case is a very interesting case. The U.S. relationship with India has been complicated. I mean, basically, in the Cold War, India was closer to the Soviet Union than it was to U.S.
And much of the Indian weaponry was made in Russia.
Absolutely. Why is India becoming more friendly with U.S. and wanting to be more aligned with U.S.? And the answer is because of its concern about a rising China and the concern. And why is the U.S. prepared to get more entangled with India? The answer is ruling powers, as they feel threatened by rising powers, are more inclined to establish alliance relationships.
Three major factors may prevent the world from having yet another major conflict, be it regional or global. First of all, we have the balance of terror. The use of nuclear warheads may help shape the strategy of what we call the mutually assured destruction.
Right.
Secondly, we face growing economic interdependence. And thirdly, peacemaking mechanisms flourish ever since the Second World War and perhaps the end of the Cold War. The disintegration of the former Soviet Union gave us yet another big opportunity for co-prosperity. And it's exactly the thing that China pursues. So, you know, China has been left quite disoriented as to what we should do to present a good image. I mean, maybe the issue of soft power should be prioritized.
Well, that's a good question, and it's complicated.
Let's focus on India. Let's focus on the India-U.S.-China relationship.
Well, I think from the Chinese perspective, the question of whether a China that's bigger and stronger wants to become the predominant power in Asia and wants to have a relationship with all the other parties, that in which, in the traditional classic Chinese manner, there's only one power at the top of the apex. Order is hierarchical. The most important injunction from Confucius is know thy place. Where are you in this order? And all the other parties are arranged subordinate.
But I'm afraid Europeans would disagree with you. They say, and they agree with China, that the world is characterized with a multipolarized order, and we would rather turn to multilateralism instead of unilateral and preemptive strikes in handling the crisis. So, in a way, the age of digital technology may help us develop a better understanding instead of turning the use of force.
Well, I think that's correct, and I think that presents many opportunities. Also, the digital age provides an opportunity for
And Thomas Friedman wrote a book about having a flat and crowded world. It means it's not just dominated any longer by a single superpower. We need to have more strategic consultation, such as the ones that we had so many times on the sidelines of the multilateral meetings, the Mar-a-Lago summit meeting, and pretty soon in Hamburg, the G20 will provide yet another multilateral platform for world leaders. So with so many dialogue mechanisms, don't you think it's ridiculous to talk about war, regional conflicts, hostilities? Instead, we should turn to extremism, separatism, terrorism. That's our common enemy.
Well, I think we have many common enemies, and those are opportunities for us to cooperate. But I think at the same time, we want to understand that from a Chinese perspective, the idea that the U.S. Navy should be the arbiter of events in the South China Sea, that the U.S. Navy should be the arbiter of events in Taiwan, as we were in 1996 when China tried to bracket Taiwan with the shells, is very anomalous. We don't like it. Chinese don't like to see U.S. Navy there. Americans say the U.S. Navy and the order, the security order that the U.S. has provided since World War II has provided the best opportunity for all the Asian nations to grow as they have. So people should actually help support this order. But so these are two quite different perspectives.
Having said this, let's come back to examine what Mr. Modi, the Indian Prime Minister, wants. I mean, this guy presides a government that used to be socialist administered, and its ideology is pretty strange. It's a mixture of many, many things. The communist guerrilla even wants to shoot the warplane with an arrow these days. So, I mean, we are facing a very strange economy on our doorstep. What does this Prime Minister really want?
Well, I agree with you. I think India is a wonderful, mysterious, strange country. And Modi, when you can look at his history to get a pretty good appreciation of who he is and what he cares about, he wants to have a great India. That's what he would hope.
Every leader wants their country to be great.
Yes.
They want to. President Xi Jinping wants to put China ahead, and President Trump wants to put America ahead of everything.
Exactly.
else.
So
Yes.
that's very understandable. He wants now to have a relationship, a personal relationship with President Trump. Every foreign leader knows that President Trump is an unusual leader, an orthodox leader, somebody they never saw somebody like this before. They're very afraid. How is this going to work? If you look, the chemistry between President Trump and Chancellor Merkel, you know, Trump refused even to have a handshake. He was always pouting. Xi Jinping, his visit was very well prepared. The Chinese government did an exquisite job, I think. And the relationship has turned out to be, personally, so far, quite positive. On the other hand, Trump made, for China, the solving of the Korean problem, the test of the relationship between the U.S. and China. And if that turns out badly, which I'm afraid it may do, this may end up, you know, as one Chinese diplomat said to me, we're always afraid we're only one tweet away from, you know, back to the bad old days.
I look forward to having you again on our program and discuss what's going to happen between the United States, India, and China.
It's a good triangle to watch, and actually Russia is an interesting piece as well. Yes.
The United States is the strongest democracy, India the most populous democracy, and China is none of the either, but we are walking our own path, shaping our own navigation independently.
China is the largest economy in the world by the best yardstick for measuring economies. The Chinese government has trouble saying that out loud.
You know, we keep our fingers crossed for the prosperity of India.
Yes.
Please let our Indian friends know that we say this and we mean this.
Yes.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir.